Hey class, it's Darwin here doing my adolescent interview culminating project. So here I've compiled the interviews of three young ladies, all in seventh grade. They're all kind of friends and going to the same middle school. So what I'm going to share with you in this reflection is things that were unexpected or surprising. What connections, differences did I see between the interviews? I'm also going to connect to all the things that we've been learning about in this young adult literature class. And most of what I'm using as a source is kind of what's absorbed into my mind. Certainly Boucher and Hinton in the textbook, but also many of the articles. But as I did this assignment, I have my compilation of the interviews, and I also wrote kind of what I wanted to say. So, pardon me for reading a little bit, but I think reading it will get me to go a little bit deeper and express some of these points. So, what did I learn from these interviews? What connections can I make to what I know about adolescent literacy? And what are some similarities and differences between answers to questions? First, let me say this was a fun activity. I really enjoyed listening to these seventh graders respond, watching their body language as they thought about their answers. I was absolutely amazed at how aware they were of literacy strategies, genres, how literature can teach life lessons, take them on journeys, help them build vocabulary, etc. It was really impressive to hear the answers come out of these seventh graders with a lot of the same exact topics that came out of the Boucher and Hinton textbook. So let's see where I'm at. So in terms of connections and differences, I found that even though these kids were close friends, they did have their own unique views, opinions, and ways of expressing themselves through these questions. For example, when asked, do you like to have your teacher read to you? Why not? We have the same answer generally, but all expressed a little bit different. So each student said no or leaned towards no. Two students mentioned hearing the book in the voice in their own mind. In other words, they didn't necessarily prefer the teacher reading to them because as they read a book, their mind kind of creates the sound and tone and voice inflections of the character, and they didn't feel that the teacher reading them could accomplish the same thing. Also, the fact that one student made an observation of, when a teacher reads, she couldn't, like if she didn't know a vocabulary word, she could go back and, either look at the context clues or decipher the word by going to a dictionary. And if she was being read to, sometimes the teachers are pressured in a 40-minute period to continue on, so there's no opportunity to go back and look at the context clues. So there was both general commonality there and some differences in the way they were responding. One clear example of a connection that comes from the question, what movies do you like to watch? One of my interviewees says anything with dogs is a plus, and that's because she has a dog. She likes to watch others in film care for their dogs and see how she is alike and different to these characters in the movies, which made me think about how many different ways Boucher and Hinton talk about how these kids experience things vicariously through books, or in this case, movies, and how literature and film can expand one's experiences, perspectives, and background information. Also, I had the last question with a few connections in the course. So the last question I designed was very open-ended, kind of after going through all the interview questions, I asked if there was anything else that they wanted to share, anything at all relative to their reading experiences, perspectives, opinions about literacy. And in the first case, we have one of the girls talking about her reading preferences from a very young age, which was a preference towards nonfiction, actually going all the way back to kindergarten. And that kind of morphed into fantasy over a period of about 7 years. So it was interesting to see how aware she was of this and how she wanted to share this detail in a very open-ended question. So one thing that I took away from this is I think, she may have been exposed to a lot of nonfiction, like little storybooks about nature, frogs, whatever. And then she had an environment where she could go outside and experience these things herself. And that kind of propelled her to want more and more and more of this nonfiction. And then eventually she kind of filled up with this stuff and shifted to different kinds of reading experiences where they were more talking about social interactions and emotions, and that's kind of where she's at today in 7th grade. Take a pause there. Okay, so continuing on with that same thought, I kind of wondered about how boys might find their individual motives for reading. With boys, we read that sometimes they prefer short articles found in magazines or the internet that deal with how to do stuff or are particularly right on their interests. This type of digital literacy is kind of how they bring their background knowledge to it. They filter out what they find is usable or instructive in their purpose for reading it, and then they ultimately make meaning and relevancy out of it and actually apply it. So I think in the case of Hannah, who I interviewed, she was self-motivated by nature. She loved what she was reading about it, and she loved going out and experiencing it. With reluctant readers, you may have to kind of trot around different genres, different literacies to find out what really motivates them. And then once you find it, then you're on the right track, and you can kind of create this environment where they're doing some things that are interesting in class, and then these activities tend to spill over outside of the classroom, which is what you want. That's part of this very big idea of trying to create lifelong learners and learning that continues well beyond the classroom. So still on that last question that I asked these students, what else they'd like to share. We had in the case of Tori, she responded that books can teach you life lessons. And I think for me, in this entire class, this is perhaps the biggest idea that I took away. I was explaining to Tori after the interview that I really had no idea that ELA teachers were geared towards enrichment of skills like life skills, social skills, civic skills, problem solving skills, critical thinking skills, and helping these adolescent students search for who they are, this theme of identity. I was really impressed with how aware these 7th graders were about the goals of their own education. I mean, they really seemed to be on the same page as their teachers. Michaela answers in this question that books can take you on a journey. Similar to one of the recent quotes from Boucher and Hinton, that fantasy can tap into the creative side and inspire students to dream and use their imagination beyond what is solely in reality and to what could or what might be. So now I'm just going to share with you just some similarities and some differences on the questions, just touching on them a little bit more. Do you consider yourself a good reader? Was the first question. So I had one student say yes because it's part of it is that she challenges herself, so a challenge perspective. Another girl said she's a good reader because she knows most of the vocab words and the grade level books and the iReady and the Lexile, so that's kind of an evaluation type perspective. And then the last student says, I would say yes because I do like to read and I read all the time, so that's kind of a quantity and an enjoyment perspective. On the question, how many books do you own? I got a pretty good variety here. I got 100 to 200 with 1,000 in the home and maybe read 60 books in the year. Another student says there's 25 books that she owns, 25 in their house, and she's read 5 in the last year. Another student, 85, has hundreds of books in the house and maybe read 200 in the year. So for me, this kind of correlates to perhaps more books in the house equals more reading, but I think it's more like more exposure to books equals more reading. I like the answers that I got on this question, so I'll share them. What does someone have to do in order to be a good reader? One student said persevere so they can succeed. Another person said experience reading, because if you don't have experience reading, then you can't really interpret things. Very good insight. Third student said be patient, because when she's not patient, she likes to skip ahead, skip chapters, and then she has to come back to figure out what went on. So again, interesting perspectives that are all different. I think I touched on this one a bit earlier, but I'll talk about it a little bit more. So do you like to have your teacher read to you? Every one of the girls put this in the perspective of how their mind, when they're reading on their own, their mind creates the character and the way the character sounds, the way the tone of voice, the inflection, and pretty much that when a teacher reads, one of the students said, if a teacher reads, say, a book in week 1 and then 3 weeks later reads a different book, they tend to sound like the same book because it's the same tone of voice. So I found that interesting. I found this pretty interesting. One response to the question, who is the best reader you know? What makes him or her a good reader? One student said, because she reads what she wants to read. And then she goes on to say, one of my friends likes gay perspective books because she thinks they are really amazing to learn from another person's perspective. So again, I was astonished at how these 7th graders are picking up on many of the very topics that we talked about in class, read in our journal articles, and read in the text. And the other thing I could say is, if they're getting exposure to this stuff in 7th grade, it's not such a shock to the senses to folks like back in my time who got it all at once. We didn't really get exposed to it much at an early age, so we were probably shocked and didn't react, in a kind of balanced way, the way students react to it today. It's no big deal to them. Back when I went to school, it was a very big deal. So it's just interesting. This question was interesting. What is the best part of your reading abilities? So we've got one student talking about her ability to bond with librarians. So it's kind of like a social aspect of her reading. She likes talking about what she reads. She likes sharing her perspectives about what she reads. We have another student who says, my best ability is reading fluently. So she's got kind of a technical perspective on the best part of her reading ability. And then a third response, short and sweet, being able to picture it in my mind, which is kind of a making meaning out of what she reads. She really feels like she's able to visualize what she's reading in a very compelling way that helps her make meaning out of what she's reading. I'll do one last question quickly. What do you feel you need to improve on regarding your reading? So I had 2 students talk about being less picky, maybe expanding into new and different types of books, different types of genres. And one student say she'd like to expand her vocab. And so you've got 2 that are wanting to expand their repertoire of books, and one wanting to expand her technical abilities with expanding her vocab. So I'd just like to give credit to the authors of Young Adult Literature, Catherine Boucher and Kaya Hinton, and thanks